So tell me just a little bit about your work and what you do. And you used a phrase, I just want to pick it up because I thought it was so wonderful. Outlier minds.
Mm. Yes. And I think I like that term because I think currently at the moment there's a lot of confusing noise around neurodivergence, neurodiversity, what exactly it means. Um, and the people I tend to work with are people who may or may not, meet diagnostic criteria for a neurodivergent diagnosis. But anyone who does a PhD, anyone who does deep research, is just more interested in things than the average sort of bell curve mind. There are going to be differences in how their minds work, what attracts their interest, how they like to use their mind, what feels good to them. And so I think it's just helpful to sort of think in terms of, maybe high IQ is a form of neurodivergence. That if you're an outlier mind, you are just sort of outside of that bell curve of, what people sort of assume your mind is for, or what you want to use it for, or how you experience the world cognitively and in a sensory way. So I think it's a helpful way to think about the differences people might have in their daily lives and in their use of their minds and their bodies and their nervous systems. That it's not necessarily pathological. It's not necessarily diagnosable. It doesn't necessarily need a label on it if that's not helpful to you. But just knowing that, of course, there's variation. So, yeah.
Marching to our own drummer.
Exactly. Yeah.
A lot of the people that I speak with are highly cognitively, if not gifted, close. I don't know if you've come across the term twice exceptional.
Yes, exactly.
It's one of my favorites. I love it. To me, it fits everything. It's literally everyone in my family and me. And, I think that for those of us who have a lot of skill, whether it's cognitive, could be tactile, whatever, kinetic, tactile, whatever. We're very, very good at what we do. I call it being amazing at your craft, but sometimes bad at your job. Because there's that sense of like, did I miss something? What am I not getting here? How come I don't quite fit in? Like what's missing? Like I know I'm great at what I do, but something keeps getting in the way.
It keeps getting in the way. And that's such a great way of thinking about it. The amazing at my craft, bad at my job, because something I think that we also don't take into consideration a lot is how much workplaces have changed. Mm-hmm. And, when I'm working with people who have come up through, academia and are now, running their own tech startup or something like that, or someone who's come up through academia and now is in university leadership or now is a PI with their own lab, being good at your craft is what's got you to the point where you are. But the job is very different from what it was 30, 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, you could be an absent-minded professor because you had a secretary, you had robust kind of support around you.
You had a wife probably who stayed home. Excuse me.
And a wife who stayed home, but you also had, I think, one of the things that's happened as things become more automated and more, tech steps in more, is that there's more of this assumption that one person can do all of the aspects of the job themselves. Which takes away from your ability to really put your attention into your craft. And so there's actually a lot less kind of support from other human beings than there used to be.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I'm just taking a note. I can't tell you how much that resonates. And one of the questions I ask people is, imagine your ideal day where you could just do what you love to do. Yeah. And even people who aren't neuro distinct.
Yeah.
Obviously we hear from people all the time. They become managers and they think, God, I never get to do my job anymore. I'm stuck in this like meetings hell all the time. Right. So So this isn't unique to us, right?
No,
I don't know
no.
if it's us. Do you identify this way, or is this just the population that you treat?
So it's the population that I treat, and I think I have a very ambivalent relationship with my with in terms of sort of identifying. I think maybe there's a little rebellious part of me that's like, I don't want to have to define, my identity. I definitely have. So the things that I would definitely identify with is I have dyscalculia and
Beautiful.
dyspraxia. So no matter how hard I tried to read music or to
Mhm.
do maths and things like that at school, it was kind of like asking me to fly without having wings. It was just, I had this very clear sense of there is just a hard limit here
Mhm.
and I can't do this, which was very difficult for other people to understand because I was really great in other areas. I was fantastic with, languages. I was fantastic with, um, but there were some areas where I was really, really far behind my peers. And I found that to be in like my adult life such a helpful experience to have had because I know what can't feels like as
Mm.
opposed to
Mm.
don't want to or this feels scary.
Mm.
Um, and with the dyspraxia, I think I'm very clumsy. Like I was never going to be an athlete, things like that. And growing up in an American system where there's so much emphasis on being an all rounder,
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
you get into college based on your grade point average, and that includes PE. And
Mhm.
people want to see that you've done sports, and not everyone is an all rounder. Um, so there's lots of diagnosed neurodiversity in my family. Um, and I guess what I'm very aware of is that I have traits,
Yeah.
but nothing that would meet diagnostic criteria.
But some would argue that your dyscalculia and
Sure.
dyspraxis make you neurodivergent because
Oh, yeah.
they're
Yeah, yeah,
clear
yeah.
brain differences.
But I think it's also one of those things where neurodivergent, I mean, yes, and I totally clearly like embrace that as an identity, but I think there's a difference between, and maybe this is what I work actually a lot with my clients on, is knowing your own skill profile and knowing the
Mm.
specifics of that versus choosing an identity. And for some people, it's helpful to have an identity and to sort of say, this is who I am and it's different, but it's also super important to know the things you're really good at and the things that you're really not good at,
Hmm.
um, without moralizing about it.
I have a slide in my presentation that says "Be boldly bad,"
Yeah.
because what I've learned in my research with people like this is like the only way you thrive and survive is you have to let stuff go.
Yeah.
You're never, it's like you said, I'm never going to learn to fly. I can't do
Yeah.
this. That's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And and we are so obsessed in corporate culture and as leaders in conquering what we're weak at. That's
Yeah.
how we train people. That's how we build leaders.
Yeah.
But you got to let some stuff go, right?
You've got to let some stuff go. And you've got to also, I think, in terms of organizational dynamics, it's also really important to recognize um, administrative work is properly skilled because my gosh, when you don't have those skills, life is hard.
Oh my
We've got
God.
to really value those people who do have those skills, and
Yeah. Beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and really make sure that you know that the people who are supporting um, the leaders and the sort of outlier minds and things like this are really well taken care of because their work is indispensable as well.
Have you ever gotten pushback from people saying, I'm not an outlier, I'm me?
I No, I've never had pushback about Outlier. I've Because I think most people who I work with can really feel that sense of I've always been a bit different. I've always been on a little bit on the outside, even if I'm completely functional and I work really well and I enjoy my job and I have friends and stuff like that. There's this slight feeling of, like I don't get things, or I don't perceive things or understand things in quite the same way
Yes.
as like the group.
Yes.
And I think that feels much more resonant to a lot of people than I have this disorder or I have this disability,
I agree. It's like I'm kind of wired differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it does, but it does. I mean, but I think the people that I speak with also, they do see how it gets in their way a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
totally embrace who they are, but it's also like, oh, this is a pain in the ass too. There is that tug.
Yes.
That's what I'm really trying to get to in my book. It's really about the tug, and it's really about exactly like what is the strength and how do I apply it at work? Am I in a place that's going to value it?
Yeah.
Am I working in the way that's going to make it possible? And then, for the things that keep tripping me up, like I can't keep on top of my email. I keep saying the wrong thing in meetings.
Yeah.
I'm getting feedback as a manager. How can we help that?
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things you said there actually is just like I feel is so important. Am I in the right place? Am I in the right environment?
Same here.
Because something that I see a lot of people, people who do have a diagnosis or who do, have a neurodivergent condition that they have kind of spoken to HR about and are wanting sort of accommodations, will sometimes get stuck in this rut of thinking, if I have the right accommodations, this job will feel okay to me.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not recognizing that there are aspects of the environment, the physical environment, the interpersonal environment, the work they're doing, that is not what they prefer. It's not what they enjoy. No amount of sensory, accommodations is going to change the fact that you actually don't enjoy your job very much, or, this is not a company culture that works for you. So I think really being able to identify your own personal preferences and your sort of needs for thriving, as well as, what needs to be sort of changed at the interface between, your makeup and the environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm just looking, excuse me, at your email. One of the things that you sort of brought up is the social demands of life in academia and scientific startups and the challenges this presents for an often introverted group of people. And then you also sort of brought in boundaries, which I think is like the other side of the coin. If you
Yeah.
struggle with some of the social demands, curious to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what often people find, and I was thinking about, what you write in your leadership book, The Anxious Achiever, and a lot of it is about people who want to be leaders and who have sought to be leaders, and being a leader is a really important part of like what they want to do. And what often happens in some of the population I work with is they've kind of blundered into being leaders. It was never something that that they necessarily kind of wanted for themselves, but they were very, very good at their area of expertise.
Yeah.
Their technical expertise, their so scientific expertise or whatever, and very often have been students for a long time. So they're in the student mentality of, I do the thing, I do it well, I get to the next level. And they end up at a level where suddenly they're kind of called upon to do a lot of other things, managing people, but also like academia involves a lot of public speaking, a lot of seminars and group discussions and things that
Board dinners, fundraising even
dinners,
now, right? All that stuff.
dinners. Yeah. And what I wish people knew more is that everyone struggles with this. Everyone in academia, even the people who seem to be really enjoying it, dread the dinners. They dread the kind of conferences. And with a lot of kind of outlier minds, you have all sorts of issues around sensory stuff and eating in public. It's like a minefield. But also, so it seems kind of almost sadistic. There's this sort of community of people who need a lot of kind of reflective time and alone time. and yet the career requires of them that they're sort of socializing a lot. So I would love for more people to know that this is hard for really almost everyone, and it's too much for almost everyone. And everyone is sort of debilitated by social anxiety after most of these sorts of events. And part of the reason they exist is to give structure and to give some accountability. And if we can think of ways to provide structure and accountability and body doubling and, you know, some sort of level of human interaction and support that is just a bit less intense, that would be so helpful on a kind of workforce level.
It's so interesting you bring this up because, you know, even in corporate, right, you'll hear something about like, we need to really round out their leadership profile, right? Like they've, you know, they've got X, Y, and Z covered. They've got the skill covered and they've got the this and the subject matter expertise, but like we need to sort of improve the executive presence. We need to improve the visibility, right? All those things. It's easy to see why we need to do that. And I've definitely worked with people and I've said, sorry, you got to suck it up. If this is what you want, you know, Brian Little at Harvard calls it acting out of character, right?
Yeah.
Some people would call it masking, but it is an essential piece of getting ahead. Where's the boundary there?
Yeah. And I think we're going to see this change. I also think, again, just thinking in terms of how things have changed in the workplace in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, and particularly before the pandemic, you had a lot of lecturers who did very boring lectures, and it was fine. You know?
I had those professors, yes.
And people learned from them, and you went to, so I think this is another thing where, sorry, I'm kind of going in circles a bit, but
no, it's okay.
If you've gone up through a career trajectory where performance wasn't really an issue, and actually people could follow you, even if you weren't being soundbitey and weren't being terribly charismatic, because they were interested in the content. And then you move to a role where you're trying to speak to a lay audience more, who need a bit more entertaining, who need to be kind of brought along for the ride. That can be really difficult. And that's where I would suggest sometimes, if that's not a skill of your leader, they find ways that work for them to be visible. And it may be being more visible in print, you know, being more visible in things that you have time to kind of write and prepare, but also having other people in the team who can bring more of that if that's what's needed, you know, to really recognize that these are discrete skill sets and not everyone is going to have everything all at once, that's not really realistic to ask from one person, I think, in a lot of respects. And as a team, as an organization, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. You want a diversity of skill sets, you know, within your team and within your organization.
But you as the leader, here's where that gets tricky. You as the leader have to be comfortable. If there's someone on your team who's really charismatic and loves getting out there, you have to be comfortable saying, you know what, this isn't for me. You go. And you're going to have to let them get some of the glory, which is very hard for a lot of people.
It is hard for a lot of people. For some people, it's not hard at all.
No.
They're like, oh my gosh, yeah, you do that. I don't want to do that.
Those are the best leaders.
Yeah. But I think a lot of what then needs to be worked on there is this kind of shame and the perfectionism. And the shame is sort of a lot of it can go straight back to childhood, feeling like the weird kid. And why can't I do this stuff that seems easy and fun for other people? And it's not fun for me at all. And some of the shame also comes from this kind of having been a student for a long time, you know, in my population who I work with. And there's a satisfaction in ticking all the boxes. And I want to do all the things correctly. It's also a pattern-seeking perfectionist thing. This is what the job requires. I want to do all of the things
Right.
so that I can tick it off and be assured in myself that I've done a good job.
Well, but
And
I also,
that,
I mean, just to interject though, I mean, there's obviously, and I don't know the academic population, but I live in
yeah.
Boston and, my husband used to work at Harvard, and it's like, there's legit anxiety that there are
Oh,
12
yeah.
other people staring down your shoulder, ready to
Yes.
step in, who
Yeah.
would gladly do what you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the anxiety is very
Yeah.
real too. I don't want to minimize that for people.
No, 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 of course. And the anxiety is huge. And I guess, and what I tend to work with people on, which I think is sometimes under considered among leaders or among people for whom ambition is a really sort of big part of life, is thinking, and where is your quality of life in this? Because that is also important.
Mm-hmm.
Where is your quality of life, and are you considering that if someone else steps in and does this for you, you are worth less? And are you going to let that kind of eat your lunch? And that's the very hard thing, I think, is to just reposition, take that different perspective for a minute and sort of say, and if someone else sort of um, steps up and takes over where I can't, my life is still worth living. I'm still having a good time. I'm still good at what I do. Um, and just putting things back in perspective and managing the anxiety in that way. Which is, I say this very glibly, it's incredibly hard, but that's the work that needs to be done, I think.
That is, yeah, that is very much. And so when you work with people, do you find patterns of perfectionistic thinking and behavior stronger in your population maybe than in some others?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Um, yes, and I think a lot of it. What's interesting to me is there are a lot of people who don't recognize their own perfectionism,
Hmm.
and some of it is because they don't look at what other people are doing very often, or they imagine what other people's lives are like and what other people's thoughts are like, and imagine that everyone thinks like them. And it's one of those things that happens very often when you're doing sort of, just sort of screening questionnaires for autistic spectrum conditions. And you will ask questions like, do you notice sounds more than other people? And almost everyone who scores highly on this will say, well, I don't know how other people experience sounds. I don't know. And so very often for people, there's a feeling of, well, this is normal and this can't change and this is here for everyone. And then you kind of ask a bit more. You say, well, why don't you ask people around you? Does your partner experience you as sort of having any perfectionist tendencies? And the people around them go, oh my God, like, yes. And this is often a real surprise to people. And sometimes that's the first breakthrough that leads to a lot of other stuff
Hmm.
is just kind of being able to gently interrogate or be curious about your assumptions of what life requires of you.
Yeah. I want to go back to the job fit for a little bit.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm jumping around. I hope that's
No,
okay.
I love it.
Um, what are some ways that people might begin to think about that question, of like, do I want to be a leader? Is this career path right for me? We can get
Yeah.
into, is this organization right for me? But like, I'm up for a promotion. I'm heading into tenure track. Like,
Yeah.
of course, it feels good. It's all the work I've put in, all the things, but like, is this really the right fit for who I am?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. A lot of people don't think about this at all until they're in it, and then their first impulse is to say, "I'm not good enough. I need to be better. I need to work harder." So there's not an instinctive feeling of is this a good fit? There's a sense of being an object rather than a subject. You know, I am not I am not the right fit. Not this isn't working.
Right. It's me.
It's me. It's me. And I should be happier in this job. Everyone wants this job. Why am I not happy? Is another one. I'm so negative all the time. Why am I? And so um and I think sometimes it's just really it goes back to thinking about your skill profiles and thinking about sort of what you enjoy and where you feel your flow, and thinking about, how can I get more of that?
Mm-hmm.
And is this situation or this type of job sort of going to give me that? And what else might I do? And I think that's a really crucial step, because very often if people get to the point where they say, this job is not for me, or I don't want to be a leader, then there's this blank. It's like, I don't know what to do. If not this, what do I do? I'll, be unemployed and homeless, and you catastrophize quite easily. So, and something that can sometimes be hard for some outlier minds is, while there's thinking outside the box that happens like out the wazoo in some areas, imagining the future of their own lives can be very hard, really, really hard.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think it can sometimes be helpful to, speak to someone very practical, like a career coach, who can just sort of say, well, here are some of the things, here's some of the possibilities. Maybe you start your own company and you can do it your way. Maybe you do this. And then think through the practicalities of how you do that, a step-by-step kind of plan, because I think people need plans a lot of the time. They need options and plans.
Yeah.
That was a kind of...
No, that's great. That's great. Is there also a universe in which, you sort of do a side-by-side comparison and you look at the pros and the cons of this role and you think about, well, how much of it could I live with? How much of it could I possibly get better at? Like, yeah, this would be hard for me and it would make me exhausted, but it's worth it. Like, is there any kind of imagining in that sense that you've found helpful?
Yeah. And I think some imagining in that sense, I think it's really helpful for a lot of people to think almost before thinking of what can I get better at.
Yeah.
Thinking of what could I let go? Where could I lower my expectations? What support could I ask for? What would be helpful to me?
Kate, I feel like we're having a mind meld. I've been working on my talk and the second half, I often do an exercise on expectations because I find with my people at my lovely anxious achievers that like the weight of expectations is so dominant, and it's like, like I've been holding on to these for a long time. Like, maybe they're not relevant anymore. Maybe I can get rid of them. Maybe people aren't expecting me to be perfect. They just want me to, so I do think the expectations piece is so huge. I just wanted to share. I'm like very much.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But also letting go of expectations is hard. And I think it's also worth thinking about your whole life, not just the professional life, because, you kind of alluded to this earlier that, people can be perfectionists and it's often pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where the perfectionism comes from, whether it's a kind of pattern seeking, problem solving perfectionism, or, something much more psychological. For most people, it shows up sort of everywhere. And so thinking about how could I free up energy at home? What expectations can I let go of for myself at home, as a parent, as a, as a partner, as a, in my hobbies, in my other, because you can't just always add more. You've got to, you've got to balance things out. You've got to let go of some things to make room for some other things. And sometimes being less stressed at home can give you the bandwidth you need to endure things that are uncomfortable for you at work.
I really, it's funny. Like a piece of my identity as a good mom was that I would like cook my kids dinner and and I've only recently just been able to like sort of let that go without my identity as a good mother in my mind totally changing. You know, it's it sounds so silly and so privileged and everything, but it was like the idea that my kids would eat frozen dinners frequently, you know, was just not part of the identity that I worked so hard to aspire to.
Yeah.
Just it just had to go.
And that's where I think identity always needs interrogating a little bit, because
Mm,
there's so much that goes into that, so many assumptions that
mm.
kind of get smuggled into there that don't get looked at and unpacked. Um, and do you know what's really helpful, which that has actually influenced my work with adults quite a lot, is there's an approach called the oh gosh, what's it? CPS, Collaborative Proactive Solutions approach by Ross Greene, who wrote a book called The Explosive Child. And
I
he
know that
works,
book.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah. And, you know, the whole process that he describes in there is about not getting into a power struggle with, with a child, um, and really identifying everyone's concerns in a situation and trying to work out how to meet the concerns rather than starting from this idea of an ideal outcome that you're pushing for. And, you know, he describes it in a much better way, in a much more sort of fleshed out way than I do. But I think this is a really useful way to think about relating to our inner children, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and to the parts of ourselves. Um, what if we're not looking to achieve this particular outcome? What if we're looking to sort of resolve these concerns? And is there a way that we haven't thought of yet that those concerns can be met that don't need to look like this?
Love that.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned, just as we sort of round out here, you mentioned something about sort of stumbling blocks that you see frequently in women who are autistic. I was
Yes.
curious about that.
Yes. So, so autism and autistic traits, and you know, the broader autism sort of phenotype, is really underdiagnosed and underrecognized in girls and women. Um, and it's not exactly clear why that is, but you know, a lot of it is due to sort of female socialization, which really prioritizes attending to other people's feeling states and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
being more facilitative. But also, very often in childhood, it's not sort of noticed because girls and women might have the sort of restrictive and repetitive interests that are more female coded.
Taylor Swift and horses.
Right. And so the, you know, it might not be parts of things like it tends to be sometimes for boys. And it might not be, you know, something that stands out as unusual in a way, but the intensity of the interest and the repetitive sort of stuff is there. Um, and so often you have, and a lot of this is to do with sort of women in the workplace and how, you know, how women are treated differently in the workplace. Um, and particularly, you know, I work with people who are in very male dominated environments. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
scientists, a lot of people in tech. Um, and and what will sometimes happen for sort of autistic women is there will be this feeling of I am being expected to do a lot of emotional labor for people. And that's really, really hard for me. And I don't know why.
Mm.
And I don't want to do it. And I feel like that makes me sort of like a bad woman, a bad, you know, a bad colleague. So it's this kind of interaction of the expectations of women in the workplace and a lifetime of, you know, often completely unconscious masking on the part of autistic women. Um, and 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 I think I've just lost my train of thought. What was I, where was I going with that? Oh yes, and other things like, I mean, the expectations on women, particularly to sort of take the lead on social things, to be more sort of gracious, and more of a sort of host role when you're doing sort of, dinners or seminars or things like that, can be very, very difficult, sort of on autistic women particularly, who can sort of feel like there's something wrong with me, that I need a lot of downtime after this. There's something wrong with me, that this isn't coming naturally to me and I don't want to do it. I think also there is more of a tendency, this is just anecdotal, among autistic women I work with, to be very permeable to other people's emotional states. And you get this with some autistic men, but mainly the difficulties for autistic men are in sort of not picking up cues, or not sort of, and that creates some sort of relational difficulties. But for autistic women, it's very often being overwhelmed by someone else's feeling state, not being able to re-regulate after someone has been robust with you in a meeting. And there is lots of terrible behavior in meetings, and lots of aggression, I think, and lots of really competitive, really, as Mark Zuckerberg might call it, masculine energy that goes on in meetings. And I think women, right? It's like gone backwards 100 years. But for autistic women, I think it's particularly difficult to turn that around and go, well, he was an asshole. That was not a me problem. And to let go of it. It becomes, particularly with that whole relational history of, I'm not really good at this with people. Have I done something wrong? Was it something, did I invite this?
Right.
And it's very difficult to let go of. Yeah.
That's really, yes, re-regulating. It's interesting. Yeah. I would imagine that regulating is something that comes up in your work a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, all of our work, but but yeah.
Yeah. And re-regulating, and a large part of that is the stories we tell ourselves about what's happening and what's our responsibility and what's not. Which comes into the boundaries thing, getting a real sense, really, really, really being clear about your energetic boundaries and about, your relational remit and what you're, responsible for and what you're not, and what
is your relational remit?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that I am not responsible for this person's mood. I don't need to fix it, and it's not my fault. I can deal with what is, and I'm allowed to feel whatever I feel about it as well.
Listen, that's the relational remit. That is the magic piece that keeps so many of us in a bad place at work, because, and this is why it's so interesting. Like when I work with leaders who have anxiety, and so their anxiety might make them a little bit more irritable, unpredictable, micromanagey, or, it's funny. I was even talking to a colleague about menopause at work, and menopause makes us, speaking from experience, unpredictable. We can be labile in our moods. We can explode. It has nothing to do with the other person.
Yeah.
But the other person receives that.
Yeah.
And especially if they're young, if they're vulnerable, whatever, they take it as their fault. It has nothing to do with the other person, but because we don't talk about it, it just keeps repeating, to me, it seems.
Yeah. And, there are two aspects of that, I guess. One is a sort of, how can you have an automatic script that you use when someone behaves in a way that is kind of inappropriate or, unkind, so that you don't have to think about it and it just becomes automated. And using that just kind of to manage your actual relationship with other people and your boundary setting and your boundary enforcing of, please don't raise your voice with me. Just something like that. So that you're establishing your relational remit externally and communicating it to others. But then also, sometimes just the gesture of being able to do that for yourself helps you believe it internally, you know. And also takes that, because guilt very often is a kind of internalized anger. And sometimes being in touch with that anger and mobilizing that anger and galvanizing it a little bit is what helps you set boundaries.
Mm.
So that when you have that feeling of, ugh, that was kind of awful what that person said to me, you can get out your script and just sort of say, hey, come on, let's kind of like bring this down a notch. That was really hurtful.
Say it to them.
Say it to them. And the value of a script is you think about it a lot beforehand and you practice it and you get it ready and you know that you're being reasonable. And how they then respond to that is their business. And you've drawn that line in the sand and you're able to say to yourself, no, I put a lot of thought into that and I am being reasonable.
Is that's something you work with clients to do?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's get that in there so people can find you. And there's probably a huge need for this.
Yeah. But it's part of what they train you sort of as a therapist. When you're doing a therapy training and they say your ethical framework and your boundaries are so important and you have to communicate them.
Mm-hmm.
You communicate to your clients like when you're going to be available and how you're going to interact and things like this. So that if there is a violation or if there is a dilemma, you can go back to that and say, well, this is what has been agreed, and this is my ethical framework, and I'm behaving ethically here. And we can work with the relational stuff around that. But it's not something I take on
right
as my fault if I know I'm doing things the way I want to.
Oh, that's wonderful.